What do you make now in retrospect of that new atheist movement?
They didn't kill belief in Christianity, they buried it. The civilization had long become secular since the boomers, really. So the atheist movement had been infected with woke postmodern identity politics. And so I was something of a heretic to the atheist movement. And even now, though, I look back and I think, God, their arguments were terrible.
The story was there is no story. People couldn't live with that. So yeah.
It's not about rational argumentation.
You're more likely to be persuaded by Tolkien than William Lane Craig.
I don't want to be cliche about this, but I really liked C.S. Lewis, actually.
Brilliance of Lewis was he actually integrated those things together.
I'm not adverse to the idea of a religious awakening. I view myself as living in a paradigm where I've had something taken away from me. And I've got to the point where now my wife is like, right, so we're going to take the kids to church. And I'm like, I'm going to have to. And so basically...
Don't be a boomer.
Hello, welcome back. I'm Justin Brierley, bringing you some brief, mini, but fun conversations from the ARC conference here in London. Joined this time by both Bethel McGrew, but also Carl Benjamin, aka, what is it, Sargon of Akkad?
That's correct.
How long have you been doing that channel?
About 11 years now, something like that.
And for those who are a bit bemused and haven't heard of it, who is Sargon of Akkad?
So I'm quite old, and in the early days of the internet, it was a wild west. It was scary. And it was generally understood that you didn't use your real name for anything. And so you would choose a pseudonym. And I happen to be a history fan. I happen to enjoy historical figures and stories. And so I just used Sargon of Akkad as my sort of screen name because everyone had their own, and you end up taking it from platform to platform just so you don't have to remember a different login and a different password. And so when I signed up to YouTube, it was just no different. I just was like, oh, girls, didn't think anything of it. I never thought I was ever going to produce a YouTube video. Then something like 3 years later, I was just a bit frustrated about things. So I recorded a very, very low quality video, put it up online, and I started getting views. And then suddenly I've got 500,000 subscribers, and then suddenly I've got 900,000 subscribers, and suddenly I'm in the news. And suddenly I'm like, why didn't I just use my real name? Because the thing is, the political space wasn't really there on YouTube when I started.
It was a fast-moving, evolving thing, and you caught the wind of, this developing moment.
By complete accident.
Yeah, to my mind as well, in those early years of YouTube, it was actually quite a kind of atheisty dominated space. That was where a lot of the new atheists discovered each other and started hosting these quite skeptical channels. Was that kind of the vibe at the time of your channel?
It wasn't the vibe of my channel. I just presupposed all of those things, really. Right. I was a fan of Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and things like that. And I had never... I didn't come from a religious background in any way.
You weren't kicking against anything in that?
No. So while I agreed with all of the sort of materialistic atheist arguments that I'm making, I was just a product of late modernity. And so everyone has those sort of presuppositions baked into them and they realize that I'm not.
You ended up kind of becoming, though, somewhat part of that milieu. And I remember there was some kind of an episode, and I wrote a book called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, where I sort of the first chapter traces the rise and fall, arguably, of new atheism. And the way in which that movement, after a sort of honeymoon period, when everyone said, yes, God doesn't exist and religion's bad for you, they then started to disagree over all kinds of social issues. And I remember one particular moment that I heard about and watched when you had a big kind of fallout with another atheist at the what was it, the Mythicist convention or something?
Yeah, the Mythicist Milwaukee convention. So the atheist movement had, not very long after its sort of blooming, been infected with woke postmodern identity politics, in particular feminism. And I didn't think this was actually the best way to conceive of male-female relationships and interactions. And so I was something of a heretic to the atheist movement, which is an interesting place to arrive at because, of course, there were definitely deep religious undertones to the moral system that they're promoting. And the Mythicist conference was a confrontation, finally, whose time had come, because for a long time, they simply just blocked us out of conversation because, of course, well, no, we've got the reins of power. Why would we want to engage with you? We'd only stand to lose something. But our influence kept growing and growing and growing. And so eventually it came to the point where I was like, okay, well, we'll sit down and talk. And Thomas Smith was not happy that I wasn't prepared to be browbeaten by progressive.
This was the sort of opponent you were speaking to.
That's correct. Right. And he ended up storming off the stage.
Yes, there were some quite chaotic scenes, I heard.
Yeah, I didn't think I even went that hard on him, really. But I just didn't agree with the moral framework he was proposing. And he had a really difficult time dealing with that. Yeah. So
what do you make now in retrospect of that whole sort of new atheist movement?
They didn't kill belief in Christianity, they buried it. They were essentially kicking an open door. The civilization had long become secular, and since the boomers, really, the boomers were genuinely quite a secular generation, and just found themselves choosing not to believe for whatever reason. And so by the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, when you had Hitchens and Dawkins and Sam Harris and Dennett having arguments with the religious right, they had a kind of rootedness that the religious right didn't have in the popular culture. And so they could draw upon a set of everyone knows this sort of assumptions. And so, and even now though, I look back and I think, God, their arguments are terrible. Absolutely. I mean, I saw a clip of Sam Harris just from about a year or two ago saying, well, I look up into the heavens and I don't see God, so where is he? And it's like, Sam, after all of this time, how have you not realized that the concept of God is outside of the material universe? Like, I'm an atheist, but your argument is just bad, right? And you failed to understand. But how did the religious right at the time let him get away with these arguments?
Well, I think there were some people trying not to let him get away with it, but sometimes it's the person with the loudest megaphone that you tend to
just as an atheist, I'm kind of embarrassed by it.
I want to bring in Bethel in a moment as my resident Christian to have a little bit of an engagement on these issues. But before we do get to that, Carl, even though you are still an atheist, I sense that you've undergone a sort of conversion to arguably the value of Christian faith. We hear at ARC, which is very much based around this idea of rediscovering the Christian foundations of the West and so on. And perhaps the figure most influential in that has been someone like Jordan Peterson in your experience. I've just been interested in hearing what that journey has been for you, even though you don't accept the supernatural claims, where you've landed regarding religion.
I'm not. I suppose I would put myself in the agnostic camp at this point, rather than a hard atheist, because there are arguments that the religious, and not just Christian either, the religious side makes that do necessitate an answer. Like fundamentally, the materialist conception is based on something coming out of nothing, which is a very difficult thing to square for anyone who's concerned about logical consistency on how they feel the universe was created. So the question of the Big Bang and all that, it just kicks the can further down the road. Okay, well, what came before that? Started that? What's going on? So there are lots of things. It's not Jordan Peterson for me, actually, who, but I appreciate for a lot of people, he has been instrumental, and that's good, because I actually do think a revival of the Christian heritage of the left is a good idea. The problem is, I think that it's kind of like asking a bunch of disabled people to just stand up and start walking. If you haven't nurtured that part of you, I think it kind of shrivels up and dies. And so this is why I'm not adverse to the idea of a religious awakening. I just don't feel with it, right? But for me, it was actually, I don't want to be cliche about this, but I really liked C.S. Lewis, actually. I read Chesterton and found him a bit of a bore, actually. Chesterton's a very strange figure, because about half of what he says in his books and what I read is, I'm like, God, that is a profound insight. And then about the other half, it's just like, that's obvious nonsense. It's obvious nonsense. And I like the sort of stuffiness of Chesterton. So as an aesthetic, I like that, but C.S. Lewis is the guy.
Yes, well, C.S. Lewis famously said, a young atheist can never be too careful about his reading. So it's fun to hear that you're...
Yeah, I like I said, I didn't want to be too cliche about it, but he makes some perceptive insights that are actually important.
Well, I'd like to return to some of those perceptive insights. Bethel, thank you for taking the chair again to sort of be the foil to what Carl is talking about here. Any thoughts on, from where you're standing, the journey that Carl has described? Are you seeing that other people going on a similar journey in any way?
Yeah, for sure. But if I could just kind of riff on, because he had so many interesting things to say there. I wrote a piece last year called "Richard Dawkins Didn't Do It." It's kind of the same idea that you were getting at there, that they didn't really kill Christianity, they buried it. So where I come from in the States, the Episcopalian denomination used to be kind of like America's established church. We never had an official established church, but it's like the unofficial established church. But then the main line grew old and declined and died. And that was all happening through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s already. And so that's, I think, what Carl is getting at, the kicking an open door. That's what happened in the United States as well. And you still, of course, did have a religious right. There was that kind of resurgence in the 80s. But I think there was just a lot of silly paranoia around this idea of, oh no, that we're going to have like a Christianism and they're going to rise up and take over. They really weren't. They were the minority. Everybody made fun of them. And so, for Hitchens and Dawkins and those guys to sort of go after the fundamentalists, it wasn't really very brave. It was like picking the already picked on kid in the class, The other thing I would say is it's funny that they called themselves the New Atheists, because nothing that they said was new. It was all just, it rewarned David Hume, and David Strauss, and like all this kind of 19th century, and then going back to just the presumption that miracles do not happen. I guess that's Matthew Arnold, right? And so I would say the same thing about the quote unquote new atheists that I would say about those old atheists, which is that they won the PR war, but they lost the argument. I don't think the arguments were ever really any good. And there were people who wrote against David Hume. There were scholars who wrote against Strauss. And it's just unfortunate that many of them, they're pretty obscure. We don't really know what their names are. A couple of people might vaguely know who William Paley is because of the watch thing, right? But by and large, we've sort of forgotten who those people are. So, a lot of my family's project, what my father works on and his kind of resourcement, is trying to kind of revive the memory, sort of raise the dead in a sense, and reclaim the forward position in a sense. And maybe now that new atheism doesn't even have the cultural clout that it used to, maybe now is a good vulnerable moment to strike.
I suppose one of the things that's become clear to me is that they're just, the story that the New Atheists told just didn't have the power to actually move people, and
it didn't tell a story.
There was a kind of a non-story at one level.
The story was there is no story. People couldn't live with that. So
and so you have people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali going on this journey, to Christian faith and so on. I guess, I'm kind of. You're obviously, you can see the value, you can see sort of, but you're not convinced at a personal level, obviously, by this stuff.
It's not about rational argumentation. That's the thing. It's about the feeling of spirit inside you.
Okay. So do you think that the kind of apologetics that to some extent Bethel represents, there is a kind of objective evidence for, the historicity of scripture, and there are good philosophical arguments of God, that's not going to move you?
No, and I think that you're actually playing on the enemy's turf too much with those sorts of arguments. Not to like I think that what you have to do is have a narrative that's so persuasive and so compelling, and something that is heroic to people that they can't help but feel enchanted by it, because the point of it is trying to bring magic back to the world. And so, I'm a very big fan of mythology generally, and it's the enchanting nature of it. Like, I don't care if Beowulf was a real person or not. The stories and the heroes matter, regardless. And so the arguing scientific evidence of the Bible is kind of basically allowing the opponent to have a chance at winning, and they can't win on the narrative side. So
you're more likely to be persuaded by Tolkien than William Lane Craig.
Far more, yeah. And And also, it just seems to me a more sensible strategic position because they've got nothing when it comes to the narrative.
Yeah, well, so I'm a big fan of C.S. Lewis as well. And I think the brilliance of Lewis was he actually integrated those things together, because he was a very clear thinker, very rationally minded, very analytical in some ways, but also an excellent storyteller and somebody who deeply understood myth and narrative and the need for a compelling heroic story. And I think Christianity offers the best of all worlds in that sense, because it is the greatest story ever told. It is the greatest of all heroes' journeys. Now, what somebody like Peterson is sort of trying to do is kind of see Jesus as, well, he's the ultimate hero, is the archetypal perfect man. There's only so far that you can really go with that because Jesus has to be unique. But I mean, I find if you go back to the Gospels, it is an extraordinary, compelling narrative. I mean, just like go through them, just read them and feel the pathos of it. Just the moments between Jesus and his disciples, and then Jesus, the agony in the garden, the agony of the cross, and then the eucatastrophe, to use a great Tolkien word, the eucatastrophe of the resurrection, just when it's darkest. And Mary Magdalene is weeping, and she can't even recognize Jesus. And then he just says, "Mary," and that's it. She says, "Rabbi," and so I think you can have it all, really, but it does ultimately have to be grounded in something true. So I have to confess, I'm not a big fan of William Lane Craig myself. I don't think he necessarily does a great job selling the story, even though some of his arguments are okay. And so I think we need to come up with better ways of getting people excited about Christianity, getting them excited about the story, about the narrative. Part of that actually might be a bit of a side note, but I think we need to create good fiction. We need more inklings, more new inklings. And Tolkien and Lewis kind of realized, I'm going to reach more people if I write books like Narnia than if I keep writing books of essays.
What is it about Lewis that you mentioned earlier has sort of struck a chord?
The way that Lewis thinks about the problems that he's tackling is a lot richer than most people, actually. It's a lot of people find themselves, I have my way of approaching this. I'm going to follow that through to its logical conclusion, which is perfectly normal and perfectly fine. But Lewis thinks a level or two below that, and then comes to a richer and deeper conclusion at the end of it. Like the abolition of man is just such a good example of this, where Gaius and Titus why wouldn't they do the things that they're doing? Because they're not being critical of the very paradigm itself. And Lewis is getting beneath that and saying, well, look, this is where we end up if we treat man as just a fungible piece of meat that's floating on a rock in space. And he's right about that. He's fundamentally right. And it's not something that's self-evident. And that's one of the things I like about Lewis.
I suppose this does edge us towards apologetics, argument territory, because, one of the fundamental issues that I've often been in the middle of between atheists and Christians is, well, how do we ground the concept of human value, and that there is a kind of intrinsic, wholeness to being a human that we can't just be described in purely material terms. And it does potentially lead to those kinds of transhumanist sort of outcomes that he was describing in The Abolition of Man.
That's why I don't call myself an atheist, really. Well, I would say I'm agnostic, really, because I haven't got an answer for any of this. And I don't see anyone else having an answer for it either, because I know it's
Christians say they do have an answer.
Well, sure, but on its own terms, it's an answer that an argument is kind of impossible to answer. So, I mean, I really get the feeling that it's not going to be possible to win back materialists to religion en masse. I unfortunately, I think that's true.
Despite a few wins in that.
There will obviously be a small cohort of people, but en masse, I don't think that's going to happen. But what I think is possible is to raise generations of children in the future who understand the importance of the Christian religion and its heritage to the West and its traditional place in the Western heart generally, and nurture that in the way that Lewis is talking about in The Abolition of Man, where the part of them that is appraising and allows them to say that this waterfall merits the beauty, that's being killed off in our schools all day, every day. And I think actually it'd be worth us being aware, no, it really is happening, and it really is a problem, and it's not natural. Like, I've got 4 children. Trust me, they all have the sense of wonder that Lewis is speaking of. They will be those people that Gaius and Titus are slowly but surely killing off, and we have to be very conscious of that. And if I were given control of the education system now, it would look very different and probably very Christian, even though I'm not one myself, which I realize is ironic. But I view myself as living in a paradigm where I've had something taken away from me. Like, before I was able to walk, this had been taken away from me, and I don't want that taken away from my children. So, for example, my son, a couple of years ago, he's 10 now, but when he was about 6 or 7, he's in a multicultural school, as children are, and he has friends who are Indian and they're Hindus, and he's like, "Oh, Dad, what am I? Am I a Christian?" I'm like, "Yes, you're a Christian, son." And I arbitrated a discussion between him and my eldest daughter, which said, "No, we're not Christian." I was like, "Yes, we are Christian." Like, just, this is where we are in the paradigm where we're Christian Englishmen. This is what we are, and you be aware of it, basically. And so he's very readily said, "Oh, I like being Christian. I like Jesus. I like," that's brilliant, son. That's absolutely brilliant. I'm glad you get to have something I didn't have.
Okay.
And it really hit me when we got our children baptized. So my wife wanted all of our kids to be baptized in her local church, which I kind of hate. It's not the baptism, it's the church itself. It's just this empty red brick structure, and it just kind of reeks of modernity, And so I'm like, look, if I'm going to go to religion, I want religion, right?
What an old building.
Yeah, it doesn't have to just be an old building, but I want, like, they have like modern pop songs playing there, and I'm like, no, I want hymns. I want, let's do this properly if we're going to sit through it, right? And so, yeah. But anyway, when we were getting them baptized, they actually did have hymns, and I was sat there. I've never heard this before. I don't know the song. I don't know the tune. I don't know the lyrics. So I'm like watching everyone around me, like my mum, my dad, my aunties, my uncles, who themselves were forced to go to church when they were young, and they hated it. And they themselves are all atheists. But my dad is there singing with his chest out, like, "Whoa," and my mum's singing well as well. She's not enjoying it as much as my dad. But I can tell from my dad that what this is nostalgia. He's 10 years old on Sunday morning in the church singing when everything was normal and secure. And I don't have that. And I realized that was something
that was missing. Yeah.
And so when my children say I'm interested in religion, that's great.
Any thoughts on any of what Carl has shared there, Bethel?
Well, I think that's beautiful. I think that's great that you're not hindering them. You're just allowing them to explore and to feel free to reclaim their heritage in that sense. So I was thinking a little bit earlier, one of my favorite quotes, which I got via Lewis from God in the Dock, I think, from the essayist statesman A.J. Balfour, which is that in order for a creed to be truly consistent, there has to be a consonance between the accepted theory of origins and the accepted value of results. So what you have is something valuable, something that was taken away from you, like you were saying. And so you get to think about, well, where did that come from? Well, it was handed down to my grandfather, by his father, da, 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 da. Okay, but where did it come from, though? And you keep going back and back and back and back and back. And eventually you hit this singularity, and it's sort of like the beginning of the world. I mean, and Tom Holland will talk about this, right? And you sort of have to ask yourself, this seems so valuable, but if my theory of origins is, nothingness, just this like meaninglessness, then this is not adding up. So at another C.S. Lewis thing, I don't remember where this is from, but something about you get to the end of the math problem, and you get something that obviously can't be right, so you have to go back and figure out what went wrong. And I think that's what civilization has to do en masse at this point. You can't just keep bumbling forward. You have to stop. You have to turn around, go back, figure out what went wrong.
I think one issue with this is that we're not properly orienting ourselves as a civilization, because the boomers did this for themselves, and that's not the right thing to do. They should have been thinking, what's good for my children? And I'm not trying to condemn an entire generation, but let's be fair, they were a pretty self-centered generation. And I've got to the point where now my wife is like, right, so we're going to take the kids to church. And I'm like, I don't want to, but I'm going to have to. I'm going to have to. And so basically...
Don't be a boomer. Yeah.
My wife wants to start taking the kids to church, and that means my Sunday mornings are gone. But it's something that probably has to be done. Even though I'm not going to enjoy it, probably my children will be thankful when they're older. And as my parents, and I don't blame my parents either. It's not their fault. It was part of the zeitgeist of the times, right? They didn't know what they had. They didn't know what they were assuming would always be with them. And they didn't know what the consequences would be 50 years later. You know, it's not their fault. And you know, it's not worth pointing fingers and placing blame. But this is the consequence of that breakage of the tradition of the religious heritage of the West. And there's only one way to put it back together.
It's such a fascinating thing just to hear you talk in these terms about being just sort of reluctantly being dragged into church because you know it's good for the kids. But it's fun, and it's a very different conversation to the one you and I probably would have had even 10 years ago, maybe.
Oh, undoubtedly.
And all I can say is, you know, well, obviously I know you'll be open to potentially learning something by going on to church, but if it is a very boring sermon, bring along your copy of C.S. Lewis and just have it on.
You know, that's not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea.
You can never go too wrong.
I tell you what, and that's another thing about C.S. Lewis. You just don't get the chest. He's rereadable.
Oh yeah.
So sorry, chuffed and fast.
I've been reading the letters of C.S. Lewis recently. It's a wonderful volume if you get a chance to read it. And like every other letter, I'm like, this is so relevant to right now. It's like, where this was written in 1940, but it could have been written for today. It's fabulous.
It was just something he dashed off to a friend or a fan or whatever. It's like, gosh, I don't think, think about it. Our emails wouldn't be worth collecting between covers someday, right? But because he was Lewis, his letters are.
I saw you kind of nodding as well in agreement to sort of the fact that Carl prefers the older forms.
Oh, amen. Gosh, I can't. I mean, I people I dearly love, and I don't want to, denigrate them or their taste in any way, but I am going to kind of denigrate their taste a little bit because it is. I grew up with a couple of different old hymnals, but all old and all just like the good old hymns. And it's really sad because there is a gradually, sort of falling away of knowledge of older kinds of music, or that you'll think it's going to be a hymn and that they tack on a chorus or something. It's like, I'm sorry, but that's not Amazing Grace.
I can go one word.
Chris Tomlin, we're looking at you.
Sorry, Chris.
So Christmas Eve, my wife was like, oh, can we go to the church? I said, yes, of course. We went to the church. I feel duty bound to not say no. And so we went to this service Christmas Eve with the kids. And instead of doing hymns, which I thought, okay, I'm on hymns, but I'll do it because it's good for them. Instead of doing hymns, what they'd done is redubbed a pop song with Jesus, and I actually came out of that angry.
You heard that the Jesus-y version of Hallelujah? That's one of the worst.
No, it wasn't even like a good pop song. It was like a very contemporary, it's something you'll hear on the radio that was terrible. I can't remember what it was now, but I was just like, my God, I'd rather a choir singing than this.
Well, all I can say is good for you for being there and being willing to kind of grit your teeth and make that happen.
Very angry about it, Rust.
You'll probably find there's another church down the road where that might suit your aesthetic tendencies.
This is my wife's sort of ancestral church, where she was baptized, her parents were baptized, and so I can't.
We make sacrifices, don't we? So I'd be fascinated to pick it up again, maybe in a year or two, just see what all this church going how it's turned out for you.
To be honest, I might raise it with them. I might say it's a female vicar or whatever. the person in charge is. I might say, look, is there any chance you can just be a bit more old-fashioned? I think actually that might get people on.
Yeah, there's going to be another contingent in the church saying, can we be a bit more modern? It's very, any church leader finds themselves in a bind.
I'm not sure any of the, because I look at the people around, they don't look very impressive either. So I'm wondering if I can
So
say,
you can be part of the young fogey brigade, bringing back the old.
I want a bit of fire and brimstone. Like I was expecting lectures. Right? I was expecting a lecture from the Bible, a moral lecture from the Bible. Nothing of the sort. I was like, come on, you know.
Well, duly noted, and thank you so much for the fun conversation. And thanks for being so candid as well about the journey you've been on, Carl. It was really fun.
I hope it's helpful. Actually.
Yeah. Thank you, Bethel, for being foil to Carl, the potentially, seeking agnostic somewhere on the journey. Who knows? But great to chat with you both.